We live in a culture, we live in a country that has a mentality that is genetic, it's organic to who we are, that we, as Americans, can and are able to do anything we set our minds to. We are rugged individualists. We don't need anything and or anyone to assist us in our lives. This runs 180 degrees contrary to everything that Christianity stands for, everything that Christianity teaches, everything that God has done by giving us his sacraments. And with that as the backdrop, I want to read Romans 4, verses 9 through 12. So please join and listen as I read those verses. Cometh this blessedness then upon the circumcision only, or upon the uncircumcision also? For we say that faith was reckoned to Abraham for righteousness. How was it then reckoned? When he was in circumcision or in uncircumcision? Not in circumcision, but in uncircumcision. And he received the sign of circumcision, a seal of the righteousness of the faith which he had yet being uncircumcised, that he might be the father of all of them that believe, though they be not circumcised, that righteousness might be imputed unto them also, and the father of circumcision to them who are not of the circumcision only, but who also walk in the steps of that faith of our father Abraham, which he had, being yet uncircumcised. And may God bless the reading of his word. Now let us do a quick overview. Remember what Paul was talking about at the beginning of this book, because as I have said before, that sets up the rest of what Paul's going to discuss in the book of Romans. The universal nature of sin, alienation of everyone from God, the fact that the world is dead in trespasses and sins, the world is at war with God, and if you know anything about the military, and if you know anything about war, you will know that it comes in various guises. I don't know how many times I've heard non-believers tell me, well, I don't hate God. Well, that's because you don't understand the nature of hatred. You think of it in a humanistic standpoint, that you are actively acting out against in hostility towards someone. What you don't realize is that when you are at war, it is overt. Sometimes it's a direct frontal assault. Sometimes it's a flanking movement. Sometimes you drop troops behind enemy lines. Sometimes there are covert actions. Sometimes you have spies. But in every instance, it is war, and you are in a fight against an enemy. And this is what the human heart is, and this is how Paul has described us in the first 3 chapters of Romans. Such that he concludes essentially by saying, there is no one that is righteous, and there is no one that seeks for God. And then he gets to this character, Abraham, and starts talking about how Abraham has received a blessing from God, this blessing of imputed righteousness. And that brings us to this morning's text, where Paul asks the question, almost anticipating our good old buddy Mr. Conjunction, cometh this blessedness then upon the circumcision only, or upon the uncircumcision also? I want to talk about what the blessing was. I want to talk about who gets it and why they get it. And I want to conclude with who are the blessed. What was the blessing? You know, when we come to this section, or anytime we talk about Abraham, we always talk about his believing. We talk about the blessing of Abraham. But do we really ever stop and think, what was that blessing? What was the blessing of Abraham? The apostle has already told us that Abraham believed, and it was counted, it was reckoned, it was imputed to him as righteousness. But what did Abraham believe? I want you to think about it for a minute, because I know what's running through your mind, and I'm going to surprise you by my answer. What did Abraham believe? Abraham believed that from death, life would come. Abraham believed that a dead man can bring forth life. Abraham believed in the promise of the new covenant. Let us turn for a second to Genesis 17, because this is the context in which Paul is talking about. He's talking about this whole section of Genesis from 12 to Genesis 17. And here Yahweh is talking about the blessing that will come upon Abraham and Sarah, and he is specifically identifying Sarah, and he says in verse 16, "And I will bless her, and give thee a son also," and notice these two words, "of her. Yea, I will bless her, and she will be a mother of nations. Kings of people shall be of her." Now there's the blessing. What was Abram's response? Did cartwheels? Threw a party? Invited all the neighbors? Got party hats? I'm going to have a kid. Abraham fell on his face and he laughed. And he said in his heart, "Shall a child be born unto him that is 100 years old? And shall Sarah, that is 90 years old?" We live in a modern world, and we sometimes look at people in the ancient world and we think these people are backwoods morons. They are not as intelligent as we are. They are not as smart as we are. They were so superstitious they would believe anything. Well, my friends, in the early chapters of Genesis, you have a disproof of that claim right here when a 99-year-old man heard God's word and said, "Dead men don't give birth. Old men don't reproduce." God, I'm not stupid. I wake up in the morning and I make old men sounds when I get out of bed. I creak. Every time I lift my arm, it sounds like a rusty gate is swinging shut. How can you tell me that at 99 years old, forget 99 years old, I got to wait another year, 100 years old, I'm going to give the world a child of my own? You see, beloved, Abraham believed God's promise. The promise that by faith, God's blessings would be poured out upon him. He would become the foundation for all faith, or all the faithful. And there are two things that you have to remember about this. Number one, this was done while Abram was yet uncircumcised. This was done while Abram was still Abram from Ur of the Chaldees, from the heart of the Mesopotamian region, while Abram was still a pagan, while he was still dead. Remember, the promise is not in Genesis 17. The promise is not in Genesis 15. That's a reconfirmation of the promise. The promise to Abraham that he would be a great nation was in Genesis chapter 12, when God told Abram, get up and get out of thy land, and you go to the land that I will give you, and I will make you a great nation. He was still Abram from Ur. But God worked in Abraham's life before Genesis 12. He changed Abram's heart. Abram believed what God told him and went. Not knowing where he was going to go, he just left. And this belief was imputed to Abram as justification. It was his righteousness. And all who follow Abram in this, who follow him in belief alone, are justified. And the second point that I want you to realize is this. The text that Paul quotes, when Paul starts to refer to Genesis 15, and we're alluding to Genesis 17 in particular, and by the time we get to Genesis 17, at least 13 years have transpired since God gave Abram that promise. For 13 years, Abram has been believing that God would fulfill this promise. For 13 years, he's been waiting to become what God has said he would become. He lived by faith. He was given the sign of circumcision after he believed, which is a significant point in this argument of Paul's, and we'll get to that in a second. Calvin points out, and this becomes significant when we have to understand how the Jews looked at this, especially this particular text. Calvin points out the Jews didn't glory in circumcision as a symbol of God's favor. The Jews gloried in circumcision as a meritorious observance of the law. A meritorious observance of the law. And it was on this account that they regarded themselves as better than others, as though they possessed a higher excellency before God. This is why it became such a challenge for the early Christians. You have to have this meritorious observance of the law. Oh, then you can take on Jesus, and you can take on this new thing. But to be a true Jew, you have got to have this. So the issue that arises isn't one about a particular act or a ceremonial rite in contrast to something else, but that under this one rite, circumcision, is included every other work of the law, everything that is to be rewarded. Paul mentions circumcision because it was the basis of the righteousness of the law in Jewish thinking. And it was given to a non-Jew. Let that sink in for a minute. Everything that identifies what it was to be a Jew in later Jewish thinking was given to a Chaldean, a non-Jew. Circumcision then carries the office of sealing, as it were, the ratifying of the righteousness of faith. It comes from belief, not from an observance of a ritual act. Or to put it simply, you don't get circumcised and then become righteous, which would have freaked the Jews out to hear that, which is exactly what Paul is saying. You receive the sign of circumcision because you are already declared righteous by God. So who gets the sign and why do they get it? I want you to notice two elements of circumcision, and they extend into baptism as well, and you'll be able to identify that immediately. Two elements that I want you to see that are represented in circumcision that are taking place is, number one, the cutting away or the removal of the pollution of sin. It could also include the cutting away or the removal from the covenant community for violating the covenant. And I'll point that out in a second. The other thing I want you to notice is a new way of life, or to be justified before God. Very, 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 very similar to what we identify when we talk about baptism, the washing away of sins and justification before God. The extension of the sacraments is a natural extension. Notice that Abraham is counted as righteous by God. Righteousness was imputed to him by God, not because of circumcision. Why? Because at this point in the history of the Jews, circumcision didn't even exist as a ceremonial rite. Therefore, the rite of circumcision was not a mark of Jewish identity exclusively. Its meaning, its power, and its force was its relationship to faith. Not only are these symbols present in the sacrament, but the reason they are given is present as well. As we have seen in what Paul has said, circumcision is not a meritorious work. Circumcision does not provide anyone with righteousness. And to ensure that no one views circumcision as such, to ensure that everyone understands that the sacraments, mark this, are works of God and God alone. The sacraments are works of God. They are something that God is doing, and God alone is doing it. We are reminded that God commanded that the most tender, mild, and weakest of us all receive the sign and the seal of God's grace. Infants. I want you to listen to this. Genesis 17. This is the prior passage before the one that I just read you, and I inverted it for a reason. Listen carefully. This is my covenant, which ye shall keep, between me and you, and thy seed after thee. Every man-child among you shall be circumcised, and ye shall circumcise the flesh of your foreskin, and it shall be a token, a sign of the covenant betwixt me and you. And he that is 8 days old shall be circumcised among you, every man-child in your generations. He that is born in the house, or bought with money of any stranger, which is not of thy seed, he that is born in thy house, and he that is bought with thy money must needs be circumcised. And my covenant shall be in your flesh for an everlasting covenant. And the uncircumcised man, whose flesh of his foreskin is not circumcised, the uncircumcised man-child, that soul shall be cut off from his people. He hath broken my covenant. And there is the other element of the removal of sin and pollution that I mentioned. Age. Age. That thing upon which we get hung up in our discussions of the sacraments today. Age is not a byproduct of the sacrament. Age is the reason they receive the sacrament. I want you to have that burned in your thinking. This is a direct connection to the sacramental work of God in our lives. And I'll explain it in just a second. Put it together. Start piecing all of this together with Paul's argument from the first 3 chapters of Romans. All are guilty of sin. All are separated from God. All are at war with God. All are God's enemy. There is no innocent person on the face of the earth, children included. No one stands innocent before God. Now, in our interaction with kids, yes, they're innocent in our understanding, but before God, we are born guilty. The reason that we sin is because we are sinners. We're not sinners because we're sin. No one can turn around and say, well, I haven't done anything wrong until this point. No. When the doctor slapped you on your butt and you took that first breath, guess what? You're guilty. And that ought to tick off just about everybody that heard that. Because that is biblical truth. God is holy and we are not. Children at 8 days old can't do anything to be justified. Children at 8 days old can't believe. They cannot overtly, externally, actively communicate belief to anyone. I don't care who that progeny is. Mozart at 8 days old couldn't communicate to anyone. Now, could God miraculously change someone's? Of course, he can do it in the womb. We've seen it in Scripture. He can do it. But the fact of the matter is that we don't know anything about anyone's heart and or soul by looking at them. And at 8 days old, children don't do anything to earn a righteous standing before God. Yet God commands that they receive the sign and the seal of the sacrament to ensure, mark this, to ensure that everyone knows that the grace received in the sacraments comes from Him, and not by anyone simply performing some ritual ceremony. It isn't, hi God, I like you really a lot, let me show the world I'm going to get baptized. I'll do you a favor, God, I'll get baptized publicly so that everybody can see how wonderful I am as a believer. Look at me. I stand before you and I'm baptized. Watch me get dunked or poured or whatever. You don't do anything to receive God's grace. God gives you His grace. And then you should be thankful. Moses has already told us that this was going to happen. That the truth of the grace of God, that the righteousness that God bestows upon His people would come from Him. That grace comes from Him. That circumcision isn't the outward act. Deuteronomy 30 verse 6, where Moses starts to talk about the remnant returning to Yahweh. And the Lord thy God will circumcise thine heart. in the heart of thy seed, to love the Lord thy God with all thine heart and with all thy soul. Why? That thou mayest live. Again, quoting Calvin, who sounds like a good Lutheran right here. You would think that he was plagiarizing Luther. I want you to listen to this. According to the testimony of Paul, they, the sacraments, are seals by which the promises of God are, in a manner, imprinted on our hearts. What did I tell you last week about what a seal was? Not only imprinted on our hearts, but the sacraments, according to Calvin, are the certainty of grace confirmed. There's no guesswork. There's no hypothetical if. There's an imprint and a confirmation in the sacraments themselves. And he goes on to say, and though by themselves they profit nothing, in other words, if there's no faith or grace preceding the implementation of the sacraments are hollow symbols. The unbeliever coming forward, receiving them, receives nothing. That's his argument. Yet God designed them to be the instruments of his grace. They are the means by which we receive God's grace. And he effects, by the secret grace of his Spirit, that they should not be without benefit in the elect. Every time a believer, every time a believer participates in the sacraments, whether it is baptism or the Eucharist, they are the benefit of God's grace being received. And he concludes with this, and I want you to strap yourselves in, because those of you who have heard stereotypical caricatures of Calvinism are going to be shocked by this next sentence. Hence, it remains a fixed principle that sacred symbols are testimonies by which God seals his grace on our hearts. There isn't a Roman Catholic who could have said it more emphatically. Now, I started with some brief editorial about the United States. And I did that because we always ask this question, why don't people come to church? I mean, why aren't our pews full? Why aren't people beating the doors down to get into church? And the reason is this, beloved, and I want you to mark this. I did a lot of marking this morning. The church doesn't offer them anything. We don't give them anything they can't get in the world cheaper, with a bigger bang. If we confronted the world as a church, and I'm talking about all of us, not simply guys that dress in dresses. I'm talking about everybody that claims to carry the name of Christ. If we told the world, you are judged by God. You don't have to worry about the future. Right now, you're judged by God. You stand condemned by God. If you drop dead from a heart attack, a stroke, got hit by a bus, hit by a bolt of lightning, electrocuted listening to your CD player, you would go straight to hell. But there's a way that you can get out of that. You see, we have an answer for your problem. You're depressed. You hate your neighbor. You're in pain. It all comes from your sin. Come. Come here. Humble yourself. Don't come here expecting to listen to a lecture for 45 minutes. Don't come here expecting to participate in some rock band, guitar classic, over-the-top, organ-playing concert. Come to be confronted by God. If you want to listen to a lecture, go to a seminar. You can get them for free, they're cheaper, and you probably could pick ones that you like better than coming here. If you're coming for the music, hey, I'd rather go listen to Black Sabbath or AC/DC, if those are my choices. And my wife will confirm that. You don't come here with an American attitude. Don't walk through those doors. And I'm not saying this to you. This is to you. Whoever has the misfortune of actually listening to this online. This is to you. Don't walk through those doors thinking that we're here to entertain you. You don't pass judgment on what goes on here. The point is you walk through those doors and you should be glad that God doesn't demand that you crawl on your hands and knees to approach him at this altar. You should walk through that door recognizing the most important thing in your life, that you are going to walk through into a place where you will have relief from sin and guilt and judgment because you are being called into the presence of the God of the universe. He is the audience, not you. You are here to bestow worth upon him. That's what worship is. You stand and you kneel and you sing and you pray and you bow because you're dealing and facing the God who created everything. And you should be glad that you're allowed to even do those minimal things. And that is why if you go to a place where somebody talks for 45 minutes and that's all you get, or you go to a place where he talks for 25 minutes and you get 45 minutes of singing and you don't get a sacrament, don't be surprised because those places don't have the sacraments. You come here. And if you come into a facility where you don't receive, listen to this, where you don't receive the grace of God in the Eucharist every time you come to church on Sunday, go someplace where you do. That's why we do this. That's why this is done every Sunday. It isn't ritual, it's real. There's something being communicated here. There is forgiveness being communicated here. There is strength being communicated here. There is a blessing by God being communicated here. He is pouring himself out in his Son every time you take bread and wine. What more do you want? Do you need to see an old insane waving his arms and jumping up and down? Is that why you come? You're missing the point. I can't stress this enough. It isn't only what I say, and please don't understand this, don't misunderstand this. I'm not minimizing preaching, not at all. This has to be united with that. It has to be. Because everything I say has to be confirmed by what you receive here. And what you receive here is strengthened by everything I say, provided what I'm saying is biblical. And that's your responsibility to make sure it is. But you have to understand. You have to understand that there is no greater gift that you receive than the continual grace of your salvation in the bread and the wine. Do you realize that's what you're getting? The moment that you came to Christ and the grace of Christ flooded your body, I think I'm ticking somebody off. And you, as Pilgrim said, felt that weight drop off your back, and you were free. That's what you can experience every Sunday in the grace of Christ, in the bread and the wine. All right, I can go on, and I'm going to stop. Let me finish by who are the blessed. Abraham is no mere model. He's no hollow example. Excuse me. Abraham engenders, he produces, he gives rise to his believing Gentile progeny by his faith. You realize that all of the world is related to Abram spiritually. In addition, not only is the Gentile world related to Abraham by faith, he's the father of the circumcision, but only the circumcision who follow in his footsteps by faith. Remember what Paul said, and this is why Paul said this. God is not a respecter of persons. That meritorious circumcision act you performed isn't a meritorious act at all. It doesn't make you, because you identify yourself as a Jew, it doesn't make you a true Jew. That was Paul's point, and he confirms it here. This faith, the faith that one exercises in order to believe, is a faith given to us by God himself. It is not a work we perform. It is God inserting his faith into our regenerated hearts. It is the word of promise that performs this work of faith in our hearts. And we are simply receiving what the promising, justifying God gives us. And this faith that he gives us, contrary to our Roman friends, is not an empty faith. It's the faith of Abraham. It is a contentful faith. Abraham believed, and look at what he did when he believed. He left his country. He traveled for miles, not knowing where he was going, what he was going to get, or when he was going to get it. But he believed. He did it after he was justified. That is our faith. It is a contentful and rich faith. And anyone that receives this faith manifests itself in obedience by following in Abraham's footsteps. Not because we're doing it under our own ability or power, but because God is working out this faith in and through us. And here's the greatest irony of all in this passage. And I'm going to end with this. In all of this, that the Jew by birth desiring to be a true Jew, and all of us following in Abraham's steps, believing by faith, are true Jews. That the one desiring to be a true Jew is one who finds his salvation outside himself by an alien righteousness, Abram, the uncircumcised.